and thanks to all of our audience for joining the session today. As Jamie says, please do post questions in the chat as we go along. So if something interests you, if you want to know more about something, if one of the panelists says something that you would like to hear more about, just write it in the chat. What we're going to be doing is throughout the session, we're going to be keeping an eye on that. As those questions come in, we'll collect them together, and then at the end of the session, I will pitch some of your questions to the panelists, and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the event. So what I'm going to do now is start by welcoming our first panelist, Chris Shaw. Jamie's already provided a bit of an introduction, Chris, so if it's okay, I'd like to just dive straight in and begin by asking you a few questions and giving you the space to describe some of your work to the people that we've got on the call today. So Chris, I mean, you've been leading a research project looking at the perception of fairness around decarbonisation across Europe. It would be great if you could tell us a bit about the background to that research and what you've been investigating.
Thanks, Alex, and hello, everyone. Yeah, repeating those thanks for joining us this afternoon. The project I'll talk about is called Fair Energy Transition for All, which has been run across Europe. Some very interesting findings emerging from it, and I'll come to those in a minute. And I think those findings you'll see that can hopefully be relevant for the work that you're doing. Some new insights. The project isn't quite finished yet. The project has 3 stages, which is workshops with economically vulnerable and marginalised groups across Europe. So we've spoken to over 900 people in 9 EU countries. And then there has been dialogue with policy experts and policymakers in each of those 9 countries to share with them the outputs from those conversations. And the final part of the process, which is yet to happen, which will be happening during the summer, is bring back some of those participants in each country to one other workshop called Fairness Forums. And they are going to deliberate on some of the policy recommendations that emerged from the engagement with policy experts. And what we're going to do, we're going to work with the participants in those workshops. And at the end of that process, when they prioritise what they see as most important energy policies to achieve a fair transition, we're going to say to them, so when you go home at the end of the day and you talk to your family, your friends, colleagues about what you've done today, the conversations you've had and the policies you've prioritised, and they ask you, why did you think those were the fairest ones? What are you going to say to them? And we're going to capture that conversation and use that as a guide, an ultimate guide for EU policymakers, so they understand how to talk about energy policies in a way that the fairness of them is communicated and understood clearly by the audiences, so that that is salient to their concerns and the issues of fairness that they've expressed. And the point here of having these, what's unique about this project is the fact that there's a recognition policymakers need to hear the voices and perspectives of these groups, and they haven't done to date. And there's a danger that the energy policies will just ride roughshod over their concerns, their anxieties, their challenges in terms of energy use. And as a result, there'll be, there's a moral question there about your exacerbating and increasing inequalities, the suffering of those who are already suffering. So there's a moral issue. And there's a practical issue about the success of the policies. The ability to deliver fair energy transition may itself be undermined if it's not actually meeting the energy needs of these previously unheard voices. So really, you need those policy experts in the conversation, so that when we come to this final part of the project, this fairness forum, the policies they're discussing are realistic ones. They're ones that actually the policymakers have said, yeah, we can do this, we can adjust this policy, we can deliver this policy in this way in order to make it, in order to respond to the concerns that we've heard that have emerged from the workshops. So that's really key. And I think that's what's important. That's what's really key, I think, is in terms of bringing these voices together with policymakers. Now, one of the other innovation with this project has been, how do you actually bring people into a debate which is otherwise quite technical, quite top-down, elitist, and quite abstract? So what we've experimented with and developed over time in collaboration with partners is a methodology that allows participants, and this could be, we've been speaking with Roma groups in Bulgaria, elderly rural groups in Portugal, all sorts, very diverse, and say previously unheard voices, and creating a framework, a space in which they're allowed and feel able to talk about their concerns about this, because most of them haven't. The term energy transition was new to them, so they're not familiar with this. So how can we connect them with this debate? And so what we did with this process was began talking about issues and the concerns that they have, and then leading into talking about how they use energy in their life at the moment, both around mobility and transport. And then we explored some energy diaries, which we took those from what's in circulation in policy debates at the moment about what energy use will look like in 2030. And exploring with them what elements of that they felt comfortable with, what elements of that excited them, what elements of that made them feel threatened, and why, in what way was it or was it not meeting their energy needs. The countries we did this in were in Belgium, Bulgaria, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Poland, and Spain, and some additional workshops in Portugal. And then there was over 150 policy and energy experts who were involved in developing the policy recommendations, as I say, will be taken to the Fair Energy Forums. So that's it, really, as in much of a nutshell as I can say. Alex, I hope I've covered most of the points there. It's been running for 2 years, and as I say, it comes to an end. The final outputs are in the summer of 2022.
Thanks, Chris. I think from the early results that we've been able to have a look at from those focus groups, one of the things that struck me was that there isn't necessarily a consistent universal understanding of what a fair energy transition is, or even perhaps what fairness itself means amongst the people that you spoke to as part of those groups. And I was wondering whether you could just tell us a bit more about the very different ways that fairness and unfairness are perceived by the different groups that you spoke to, and how those differences play out across the 10 different European countries that you were doing the research in.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I'm sure there's a lot of excellent work being done on this issue and topic amongst the people on the call today in this meeting. And my finding from this work is that perceptions of fairness around energy are very individualistic, very individual, very idiographic. They're around, I wouldn't say there's one universal understanding of fairness across Europe. That's not what we encountered. I mean, there's a general sense that those with most ability should do the most, e.g. governments and big business, but that's quite abstract, quite vague. Actually, where the touch points, the pain points around fairness were being felt were very specific to people's life circumstances. And there was some cultural context as well. Let me explain it first about the cultural context. So, for example, when we spoke to people in Denmark, there was an expectation, a belief, and a trust in the state, or to a greater extent than we saw in other countries, a trust in the state to be a partner in this transition, to provide the support, to provide the technologies, to provide access to those technologies, to provide the knowledge needed. And then we went to somewhere like Poland. So that would be a fair energy transition is one where the state acts as a partner with me on this journey. In Poland, it was very different, where their experience of communist rule and their enjoyment of kind of their relatively newfound freedoms in market democracies was something very valuable to the participants. And there was any kind of policy that involved greater intervention in the lives of people by the state was seen as a threat, was seen as implicitly unfair, as robbing them of the freedoms that they had. And for that reason, they did not really see the state as an actor they wanted to be working alongside. So for them, any state-led interventions on the energy transition were, to be feared and seen as inherently unfair, as inherently a loss of freedom. Now, so you get these sort of cultural differences emerging at the national level, but then also when identified some particular kinds of positions and groups that were having different attitudes to what fairness meant. Or I should say more, it wasn't that people were carrying around a positive vision of a fair future so much as a sense of a threat to what they valued, and that threat is being unfair. So almost fairness was being perceived in a negative. It manifested, made itself felt and visible in a negative way. And so, for example, I remember one particular case study of a person who was looking after, who had a disabled child. And any change to energy policy that looked or felt like a threat to her ability to care for her children, and this was also manifested amongst other parents who were not well off and trying to do the best for their children, anything that was felt like a threat to their ability to do that was seen as unfair, inherently unfair. The most important thing that energy policy could do to be fair was to help them, support them, be a good parent, provide a decent future for their children. And then for others, obviously, and I'm sure many of this may not be news to anyone, but for rural participants, any policy that was limited their mobility was unfair. Okay, so whereas in cities that wasn't such an issue because there's public transport and you can walk around, etc., etc. For rural participants, there was very much felt to be unfair to limit their mobility, and also then for many elderly participants, or the old participants, anything that was dependent on new technologies was felt like a threat and unfair, that they would not be able to keep up with that or adopt those new technologies, and they would be disadvantaged. So I would say that it's actually quite an individual. There's cultural context and there's individual context. There's no one single story of fairness that's emerged from this project.
That's really interesting, and I think has some potentially quite important implications, which I want to try and get us talking about now, if that's okay. Given what you found, and given the context that we're in which most European governments are now bringing forward net zero targets, or in the case of the UK, have already adopted a net zero target, what do you think the implications of these findings are for the ways in which governments communicate and frame the policies that they're bringing forward? Like, what does it mean for the way that they engage with the public about what is going to be happening over the next few decades?
Yeah, important question. Well, I think as much as this project has done, it says, I think it does begin with listening to people, not making assumptions. So for example, it hadn't really occurred to me before going into this project, but one of the we did hear quite frequently in a number of workshops in a number of countries is, well, why are you coming to me to do something on this? I'm doing everything I can to reduce my energy use as it is, because I can't afford to do anything but. So, there's already, I think, anyone seeking to communicate around this with groups such as the ones we've been working with on this project need to recognize that people are doing something on this anyway, that this audience is not, in a way, they're not the primary emitters, as it were. So recognizing that people are trying to do what they can anyway, even if it's not for reasons of climate change, I think is important. Recognizing, it's very difficult. We see this time and time again. What we heard in these workshops, and I see it all the time, there's a concern about climate change. People who heard about climate change are concerned about it. There's not a skepticism about it. There's no cynicism about climate change. There's desire to live in a clean and better future. There's not a great deal of knowledge about how energy use relates to climate change for these people. They realize energy is an issue. They support energy transition. They want energy to be cheaper. They want it to be reliable. They don't want it to be so dirty. But they don't really see that as related to climate change. I think also anyone going in related to that, anyone going to communicate with groups such as about climate, about energy transition, should recognise that they've got limited agency, these groups. Often then rented accommodation, poor quality rented accommodation, they have no control, they're not free to start changing, to insulate the property. They haven't got the money to go and buy new energy saving equipment, appliances. So again, putting the pressure on people to make changes when they're not the worst emitters and when they're carrying a lot of other burdens is something to be that they really do need to be considered in the communications. But my final point on that is I would urge people going into this space to begin by listening and understanding the concerns of what feels and looks like a fair energy transition to your audience, and work from there.
Thanks, Chris. That's really, really interesting. And thank you for drawing us back round to the implications of that research, because I think some of those points are really, really key, especially for people who are working within government or working on behalf of government to communicate these policies. I think that the importance of listening before you go charging in to communicating, talking about these issues is really, really key. Thanks for your time, Chris, in talking to us about that research. To our audience, please do remember, if you've got questions for Chris, if there are things that you would like to hear more about, if there are things that you would like to hear him expand on or add more detail to later in the call, please do post them in the chat. We'll then collect them and bring those questions back at the end of the meeting, and we'll hopefully hear a bit more from each of the panelists during the Q&A session as well. What I'd like to do now is bring in my colleague, Susie Wang. Susie, you've been leading a research project that looks at the ways that people with different political outlooks perceive fairness, and specifically perceive the fairness or unfairness of climate change policies and net zero policies and all of the measures that are being brought in order to bring us towards net zero emissions. What would be great would be if you could just tell us a bit more about that research and the background to it and some of the methods that you've used.
Hi, Alex. Thank you. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here. It was really great to hear the conversation that you just had with Chris as well, because I think that there are lots of linkages. I think, yeah, as you say, that the project that I've been working on also with Chris has looked at the UK public's views on net zero and fairness. And we've done this because we know that fairness is one of the key concerns among UK citizens when it comes to climate change action. So for instance, one of the top recommendations that came out of the UK Climate Assembly was that climate solutions should be fair to people in different sectors of work, people in different incomes, and people in different parts of the UK. It's also the way that fairness intersects with net zero is especially important right now with regards to the global energy crisis, putting pressure on governments and businesses and households as well. So the work that we did, we conducted a 4,000 person survey across Britain, and we looked at people's attitudes towards net zero and how they expected their lives to change, and also their attitudes towards fairness and different policies. We followed this up with 4 focus groups with particular segments of Britain. So for those of you who have heard of Britain Talks Climate, it's a project that we released I think 18 months ago, and it segments the UK public into 7 value-based groups. And for these, we focused on the 4 who were mostly conservative voting segments. And the aim of this project was to see if we could find sort of unifying narratives for a fair transition to net zero. And we wanted to see, in particular, between these 4 segments where the fault lines were. We wanted to identify maybe some similarities, but also their differences. So how do they think that their lives will be affected by net zero? And also, do the segments see fairness differently? Kind of comes back to what you were saying earlier, that different people have different ideas of what fairness or a fair transition can mean. And these are crucial to working out what kind of narrative we can build.
That's really interesting. And what would be great would be if you could elaborate a bit on the different ways that these different value-based segments of society see fairness. And what I'm wondering is, perhaps for the audience, you could give a kind of very brief overview of the way that that kind of values-based segmentation worked in your research, just so that for the people who aren't familiar with the background to that, with the Britain Talks climate model that we use, they kind of grasp how that process works and what those different value segments mean. But then perhaps just say something about the differences that you found between the different segments, the different value segments that you conducted the research with.
Yeah, absolutely, I can do that. So I think, yeah, a brief intro to Britain Talks climate first. So what we did with this value-based, it's a complicated term, value-based segmentation. Essentially, we asked people a lot of questions about what sort of constitute core values according to our partner on this project, More in Commons, core belief model. So we asked a lot of psychographic questions about people's identities, about their views about the world, that sort of underlie attitudes which sit at a sort of more sort of flexible, changeable level, but these underlying values are much more stable. And we grouped people based on what kinds of values they had. And this led to 7 distinct groups of Britain that fall sort of in all kinds of, in all places around the UK, in all age groups, all genders, all political leanings as well, but there are trends. So for instance, I mentioned that we identified 4 majority conservative voting segments, but the reasons that they might vote conservative are different from each other. The reasons that they might support climate policies also differ. So this is a really useful framework that we and other organizations have been using to make sure that we're speaking to and engaging with a broader section of the UK public. And I'll, as I talk through some of these results, I can give you a bit more sort of detail about some of these segments, for instance.
Yeah, so, yeah, that would be great.
So I think the question was how do perceptions of fairness differ?
Right. So we've got these different segments of the UK society that have been split out based on their values, and I think what would be really useful for us to understand, for the audience that we've got with us today to understand, is the different ways that those groups view net zero targets, the different ways that they view the fairness or unfairness of those policies.
Yeah, great, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to start with commonalities actually, and then I'll go into the differences. So in some ways there were points of agreement. So I think in general, most of the segments and most people say that it's more fair for people who, for instance, higher income, higher consuming households to pay more taxes, income taxes, road taxes, in order to help the country reach net zero. In general, most of the segments also said that it was more fair for lower income households to, for instance, get grants or money to insulate their houses than it would be for a high income household. So there is a sort of overall trend where this identification of different capacities is coming into play. But there are also differences. So some had a more global perspective than others, but particularly I'm focusing again on the conservative voting segments. So one of the conservative voting segments is sort of economically conservative and socially liberal. So they differed from the others in that they had a much more global perspective. They talked about sort of equality of opportunity and making sure that different needs and capacities are taken into account. On the other side of that, we have a segment that is, I guess, more both socially and fiscally conservative. And this segment tended to see fairness as literally the same treatment for everyone. So exactly the same rules for everybody. And unfairness is where people don't follow the rules or when they exploit loopholes. And this was particularly the case when it came to financial issues. So people would talk about people not paying their taxes and things like that. And this came out really strongly in a couple of segments. For another one, the loyal nationals is what we call them. They tend to be older. They're more likely to self-identify as working class than the other segments that we identified. This segment was very reactive to there being one set of rules for the elites and another for ordinary people. And this was for government elites such as MPs, as well as for big businesses, for instance, or wealthy individuals. And what was interesting about this group is that they kind of differed again because they were one of the conservative segments that was most likely to see taxing the rich and giving benefits to the poor as a fair way to get to net zero. And then there was another group again that had a different view. And for this segment, they're the most disengaged of all. So they're the hardest to reach for us, but also just least interested in anything to do with politics. They're very skeptical of progress, of changes that they're seeing in society. And for them, fairness wasn't really something that they expected from life. They sort of see life as by nature unfair, and that fairness wasn't attributed to any sort of systemic inequalities. It was more about individuals and how you get out of life what you put in, you make your own luck. And as a result, when we asked different questions about what policies would be fair for which kinds of people, this segment was most likely to say that all of these things were unfair, even if those policies are likely to benefit them in the end. And this is particularly interesting because so this segment is one that could really stand to benefit from the fair transition, but they're not buying it. So I guess that's kind of what I wanted to say about the differences. I kind of want to turn this back to you a little bit here, if you don't mind. I know that you did some work with people in post-industrial areas of the UK recently, and this last group that I spoke of overlaps somewhat with these communities, and I wondered if you found sort of results that echoed things or things that were different.
Yeah, we did. We found some really similar things. What we did was carry out focus groups with people in areas that are currently highly dependent on fossil fuels for a large part of the employment in the area, or historically have been. So we did focus groups in the northeast of England around Durham and Newcastle, around so-called Megawatt Valley near Drax Power Station, around Selby and Goole, and then in Aberdeen, which obviously has a long history of oil and gas there. And we asked people in a very similar way, Susie, to you did in your surveys, and that Chris did as well in the focus groups. We asked people what they thought fairness meant in terms of a transition away from high emitting industries and towards a low carbon society. And we found two quite interesting kind of divisions that you've already touched on. One was a group of people who felt that fairness meant everyone being treated the same. That was their immediate reaction when we asked them, what does fairness mean to you? And then a kind of opposite reaction, which was much more around equality of outcome. So rather than everyone being treated the same, people ending up in the same place, essentially. But what I thought was interesting was that when we talk about a just transition or a fair transition, those conceptions of fairness are not necessarily the same as the things that perhaps as campaigners or advocates or governments who might be talking about a fair transition, and they don't necessarily match up. I mean, another really interesting thing that we found in the focus groups was a real skepticism towards government intervention and the policies that might be part of a fair transition. So we asked people a lot about the potential for retraining and reskilling in their area, and whether they felt that that might be something that would work for their area, whether it would be something that they might participate in. And before we even got to the point of talking about whether those initiatives might make the transition more fair, people really told us that they felt a kind of real kind of skepticism or cynicism about whether those projects would actually happen on the ground, whether they would actually be delivered. And that was completely understandable, because most of those areas, most of those communities that we were interviewing in had seen the educational infrastructure, the colleges, further education colleges, technical colleges, being eroded over the last few decades. So when someone says, how would you feel about, people in your area retraining to work in renewable energy, their immediate answer was not, yes, that would make the transition more fair. Their immediate answer was, well, I just don't believe that that's possible or it's going to happen, because, the college has been closed recently, or the technical college that we used to have doesn't exist anymore. So I think, we found some kind of really similar things, some kind of commonalities coming out of those groups, and what you found in the surveys, and what Chris found as well in the Europe-wide focus groups. What would be really great, Susie, before we move on, while we've still got you, is I think one of the things that struck me about your research, when we've talked about it internally and when you've presented the results to us, is that I think it does tell us something about the potential pitfalls or potential risks of just kind of rushing into communicating and framing net zero policies, or the transition to a low carbon society. And I was wondering if you could maybe just draw out, on the basis of your research, what you think some of those risks are that people need to be aware of when they're trying to communicate in this space.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alex, and also for sort of going over your work as well. I think it definitely matches up, and lots of fascinating insights. Yeah, in terms of the risks, I mean, this, just to say first, this is still a work in progress. It's very, very new. To answer a question I saw in the chat, the results of this project will be released around the end of April. So there will be a dedicated webinar for that. And we'll update our Britain Talks Climate Web Toolkit with the details as well. I guess, so we're still sort of coming up with the final sort of this part, the final finalized section. But I think one of the things that has come up is that that net zero and climate change are still quite disconnected issues from people's lives. That net zero in particular, people have quite low knowledge of the meaning of the term. So we, in our survey, asked people to identify the correct definition out of 4. And I think the highest was among the most engaged segment, but the remaining segments fell between, I think, around 40 to 30% accuracy. So there is a bit of a gap there. And also people are sort of concerned about climate change as an issue. That's something that we see a lot, but they're not really seeing climate change as a political issue or an issue that they can personally influence. So there is a need to build on those connections, particularly now, I guess, in the context of this work. We also asked people why is it that they're worried about climate change? And one of the things that struck me from this work is that 3 of the 4 conservative segments, they're sort of, one of their top answers was that they were worried that climate change would increase their cost of living. Even sort of, especially in this climate, it's a very salient point that we need to address. And both definitely in policy as well as in communications. It's clear that from the research that we presented today and other work, that the idea that climate policy needs to protect the vulnerable is something that has a social mandate. That the most vulnerable shouldn't be asked to bear a disproportionate burden seems to be a trend across the segments. And I think that these risks also, actually just one more. So we found that one of the conservative segments, they, I mean, generally see protecting the environment and maintaining a stable economy as things that you can achieve at the same time. But there was a sense in focus groups that if forced to choose between those two, they would choose the economy. And so part of this is being aware and acknowledging the concerns, and avoid maybe pitting the economy and environment against each other or framing them as necessarily mutually exclusive things. But aside from that, there are also some potential opportunities. So people saw health and well-being as one of the key positive outcomes of the UK reaching net zero. And that could be an opportunity because, for instance, healthcare is a political priority for a lot of people in the UK. And the other one that I wanted to mention was this idea of energy independence and self-reliance. So our work has been done, sort of the focus groups in particular were done the week. 3 of them were done before Russia invaded Ukraine, 1 of them was done after. And so this was sort of it came up, and people were connecting the energy crisis with the war, but we're not yet connecting climate change with the energy crisis. And there's an opportunity, I think, here in talking about how the transition to renewables could be a way for the UK to build energy independence and build self-reliance. And in the past, we've asked questions about self-reliance, and that term seems to be something that strikes a positive chord with all of the 7 segments and not even just the conservative segments. So I think those are my key points. Thanks, Alex.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Susie. We'll wrap up there with your question, Susie, if that's okay. To our audience, if you've got questions based on things that Susie said, if you'd like to hear more about anything that she's raised, please do put your questions in the chat. I will collate them, and we will then circle back round at the end of the session and have a bit of time for Q&A and for me to pitch some of your questions to our panelists as well. What I'd like to do now is move on to our 3rd and final panelist, Robin Webster. Robin, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Great, thank you. Robin, you've been working with a group of civil society organisations, specifically on the way that they engage their audiences around the idea of fairness, and the way that they engage their audiences around the idea of fairness when it comes to policies designed to tackle climate change. It would be great if you could begin by saying a little bit about what motivated that work and why it has this focus on the idea of fairness.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, absolutely happy to, though I think a lot of what I'm going to say will cross over with the really interesting conversations you've had so far. But I think the first thing I want to talk about is the concept of fairness. It's really fundamental to us as people. Like, I was talking to someone else I'm working with on this earlier on this week, and saying how one of my mum's favourite phrases when I was a kid was "life isn't fair," and then he said, "Oh yeah, my mum used to say that too." And I think it's something which is really universal to us as people, and is kind of really embedded in us in how we think about the world. And that's not something that we can kind of extract from human nature, and therefore it's not something that we can extract from how we think about climate policy and how we think about people's response to climate policy. Second thing I say about why this is something that we felt like is really important to think about and reflect on now is that we're at a moment, sometimes the phrase is used, we've kind of taken the low-hanging fruit, as in the climate policy, the changes that we've seen in our society that have started to put us on a downward trajectory of reducing emissions, that have raised more awareness, have often been changes which are sort of somewhat invisible to people's day-to-day lives. But we're now starting to move into a place where the real fundamental and rapid changes that are needed are going to have an impact, must have an impact on the way that people live in our society. And I was thinking that while Chris was talking, that kind of, I live in a rural area myself, and exactly, yes, that sense of like mobility, can you drive your car? It's absolutely fundamental to how people think about their lives on a day-to-day basis. And the idea of new technologies and people having to take on those new technologies, have their lives and houses disrupted by people tramping around and changing the way their heatings work. This is a fundamental to our lives. These changes are fundamental to the day-to-day life. And the question of whether those changes are perceived of, experienced as, seen as fair or unfair are really going to be fundamental to whether as a society we're willing to take them on. And that means not only whether politicians are willing to advocate for them and say we're going to have to make these changes, but also politicians are looking towards their constituents and saying, are my constituents going to be okay with this? So that kind of pressure has to go both ways. Social change is about the interaction between society and the elites, and how both each drive the others in terms of change. And these changes have to be perceived as fair, or they're just not going to happen. I think a third question, which is perhaps more relevant to the moment that we're experiencing politically here in the UK at the moment, we have seen a sense of, we've actually been in quite a privileged position, I suppose you might say, in terms of the climate change debate in this country for the last decade or so, is that it hasn't felt massively politically polarized. There is this growing awareness, growing consensus that people understand that we need to be tackling the climate crisis and want to do that. But we are also seeing, of course, a massive impact on living standards from external factors, the huge tragedy of what's happening in Ukraine, the sense of uncertainty that everybody has about what's going to be happening to cost of living, and the potential that certain actors are willing to try and exploit those kind of situations and try and exploit people's sense that it's not fair that particularly to make an argument that people on lower incomes are going to be hit by the changes to net zero, and that's therefore we shouldn't be making that transition. And I think as communicators around climate change, as people who understand what a crisis climate change is and are thinking about how we engage with that socially, that's not something that can be ignored. We can't say, and I think there is a tendency sometimes amongst climate campaigners to, when you see these arguments being made by other actors who are opposed to change and to political change, to kind of try and dismiss it or say, like, those are the bad guys who are making that argument and that's nothing to do with us and let's try and ignore it. Like, we can't do that. This is too fundamental to us as a society. That climate policy has to be fair and has to be seen to be fair, or it will be exploited and we will not get that transition. So these kind of interaction of factors happening all mean that we can see how important it is that we're thinking about fairness in the context of climate policy. And I think you've been talking really interestingly with Susie and Chris about kind of, it's complicated. It's really complicated about how we think about fairness. For us, that's going to be like the headline for our report. It's really complicated. You can draw all these different routes and dynamics and cutting the cake about how different people think about fairness. And again, when you think about the tendency amongst progressive campaigners to think that everybody else thinks like them and thinks like us, is to talk about fairness in a certain way, which actually does not reflect what somebody else from elsewhere with a different background, different political perspective thinks of as fair. So we could say it's really important that we think about fairness and we talk about fairness in the climate change debate. But if you start talking about fairness in a way that actually doesn't mean something totally different to your audience, then that is potentially like that's going to make the problem worse. And you've been reflecting, for example, some of the stuff which is really kind of the sort of basics of it, that people who are more leaning to the left are more likely to say that to be fair means an equality of outcome. People who are more leaning to the right are more likely to say to be fair is about equality of opportunity. That's one way of cutting the cake. Other ways of cutting the cake is thinking about the different sorts of fairness, like procedural fairness, which is about fairness in decision-making processes, as opposed to fairness of the decision that you come to. Intergenerational fairness between different groups, different generations. Like, you can start thinking about this in lots of different ways. And one of the things that's kind of prompted us to do this work is to think, let's get through this a little bit, let's cut it down, give ourselves a chance to actually create some sort of clarity that people can start working with who are communicating around climate policy, and therefore that will help us sort of put a foothold into understanding the arguments that are being made and into speaking to audiences in a way that's kind of intelligent and, as Chris said, sort of respectful of people's perspective and their life experiences.
Thanks, Robin. And so in this project, you brought together a group primarily of civil society organizations who were interested in talking and thinking about the way that fairness exists within this wider debate about climate change. what would be great would be if you could elaborate a bit on the process that you went through with these organizations, the kind of, you know, what you did with them, how you work with them, what you found. That would be really fascinating.
Sure. And I should say this is work in progress. So it's not, I'm not sort of talking at the end of an all singing or dancing process, but one that we're kind of in the middle of. But I mean, quite a lot of this, the nuts and bolts of it are that we, first of all, as Climate Outreach, started thinking this is something that's really useful and important and we need to be thinking about. And the first thing we did was try and get our own house in order and think, like, what do we know internally as Climate Outreach? And then we reached out to other colleagues, and I should say this area of work falls under our Climate Engagement Lab. And the Climate Engagement Lab is an area of work where we're working in a focused way with groups of civil society to try and operationalize the social science of climate change, operationalize Climate Outreach's knowledge base, and use it and think about how to work with groups such that we can use that effectively, and particularly to working with civil society to think about how we can reach out to different sorts of audiences. So it's fallen under that area of work. And the Climate Engagement Lab, as a part of the Climate Engagement Lab, we're working with quite a wide cohort of different CSOs already. So as a part of sort of starting this process off, we kind of put to call out to different groups who we were engaged with already, who are already thinking about fairness in the climate policy world, or fairness, how we think about fairness in the UK and how we think about it in the context of climate policy. And I guess in a way it sounds a bit boring to kind of go through these nuts and bolts, but actually I think what's quite interesting is, like, sometimes we don't do this. Sometimes we don't kind of like reach out and think, well, what does everybody else know? And how can we actually just have a really open conversation with people bringing their questions, their worries, their past experience, their concerns, and we just sort of did that brainstorm, brought our knowledge base. And I should highlight, you know, for example, we've drawn really heavily and talked to colleagues at the Fairness Foundation, in IPPR, as part of the Environmental Justice Commission. You know, we've started to bring in some of those, bring in expertise, and we just had a sort of brainstorm and conversation about that before Christmas, and particularly generated quite a long list of questions. And there were definitely moments in all of this, you know, I was talking about how to cut the cake, particularly when I really felt overwhelmed by all the different ways that you could cut it and all the different questions that it does raise. And then started thinking about it, started working on it within Climate Outreach. And then as we started to develop what a report might look like from Climate Outreach on this, we again went back to the same set of colleagues and said, this is what we're starting to think about, you know, what's your feedback? Is this useful? So we're really kind of testing and retesting as we go along. We're currently in the process of writing a report which will be focused about fairness in climate policy, and will be focused towards UK civil society. And I think partly what we're doing with that report is, as I said, I was talking to a colleague earlier on this week about saying, I think the answer is tabulation, as in it's about kind of bringing some clarity to all the questions that people are tangling with. I think actually part of it is also recognizing our own limitations in this space. This is complicated, and it's hard to work through, and it brings up really fundamental questions about our history as a society as well, and what our history and justice issues. And I think part of what we're doing is sort of creating as much clarity as we can, and also saying, here are some areas where we actually need to understand a little bit more. So I think one area that's, for example, popping up at me is intergenerational fairness, whereby my understanding so far, the theory indicates that intergenerational fairness should be a really powerful frame for talking about climate change. The practice and the polling so far seems to indicate the counter. So what's going on? You know, so, and we don't have the answers to these questions yet, but I think part of what we're trying to do with the lab is really get that joint pooling of expertise, of thinking, and to try and find a way of pulling that together so that people can think about these really knotty questions together.
That's really interesting, Robin. Thank you. What I'd like to do now is ask you to reflect a little bit on what you think the implications for this work are. And the reason I think this might be useful is we've got a lot of people on the call who are working with community organisations, local government. It's really interesting to see from the chat where everyone is based and the projects that they're working on. But what strikes me about all those messages that are coming through is that we've got a lot of people who in many ways are on the front line of communicating climate change, right? We've got a lot of people on this call who are, on a daily basis having to have those conversations, engage with people, talk to people about, what climate change is going to mean for them, or perhaps more accurately, what the net zero policies are going to mean for them. And what I think would be really useful, Robin, if we can, is for you to just say what you think the implications are of the work that you've been doing, like what you think the useful takeaway messages might be for the people on this call who are engaged with that kind of work at the moment.
Sure, thanks. And I suppose again I have to flag that it's work in progress. So some of what I'm saying is, is those thinking processes in progress and have to be sort of caveated by that. But I think some of the things I would say is, perhaps it's a little bit obvious, but you can't forget about fairness. And I think, as I said at the beginning of what I was saying, sometimes when this stuff is really tricky, there can be a slight tendency to say, it's just being exploited by people who are opposed to climate action, let's not give them the space, let's just go on. And I think, perhaps a strong message even that comes from all of us is that this is so fundamental to who we are, to how we think about the world as people, that we just can't kind of like pretend that it's not there. And that climate policy needs to be fair and needs to be seen to be fair. And like there's that interaction between communications and reality. Sometimes you can't communicate your way out of something that's fundamentally unfair. So I think, those thinking about both of those two aspects is incredibly important. And where the policies do not feel fair, like highlighting that and understanding that and standing side by side with the people who are going to be most fundamentally affected is a really important part of what this is about. I think so I've written like it isn't just comms, it's the reality of it, but there's also, it's building that understanding of fairness into what climate policy advocates advocate for. So there's quite an interesting, moves, for example, the group Possible is calling for a frequent flyer levy because about 15% of people account for about 70% of emissions from climate change from flying. So if you think about that, it's like they absolutely calling for that can actually build in that understanding of the different impacts that people who have different levels of income and what that actually means in its interaction with climate policy. I think there's, something that I think we spend, or have certainly feel like I've spent quite a lot of time doing at climate outreach, is asking climate advocates to stop saying things and say a bit less and listen a little bit more. And I think when we don't actually know what's going on, a really simple way of doing it is to think about, speak to people from the audience that you're interested in communicating with and ask them, about their perceptions of fairness, about how they think about climate policy and fairness, because I think we can be really kind of surprised by what the answers are. One thing that's kind of jumped out at me, I think it's from results from the work that Susie was talking about, is so progressive activists, the segment from which many kind of activists are from, many advocates are from, have quite a different attitude to most of the other segments, to ideas around whether there should be like special rules for high emitters rather than the same rules for everybody. And progressive activists are much more in favour of special rules than other groups are. So it's like, if you don't actually ask the questions and look at the polls and think about it, you may actually well make arguments that sound great to you as a progressive activist, but are not going to sound great to your audience that you're communicating with. So I think, reflecting on that, asking the questions, trying to do it as intelligently as possible, sort of sharpening those arguments around fairness, understanding that it's really embedded in us and it's something that communicators just can't avoid thinking about, is what does fairness mean to the people you're working with is a really important part of the process. And I suppose, as all researchers end up saying at the end of their reports, doing more testing, as in like, I think we understand in doing this work in climate outreach that that we are limited by what we're understanding here. We're doing our best to pull together, what we're learning to understand, but it is a journey, and that, you know, it probably will require more research, it will require more thinking, and that's something that, like, I think those who are advocating for climate policy and for climate change engagement really need to be kind of reflecting on as a group as we go forward.
Thanks, Robin. That's really, really interesting. What I'm going to do now is draw this part of the session to a close. So thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your work and sharing your insights. Thank you also to the audience for posting questions in the chat. We've had lots and lots of questions coming in from you, some on the chat, some of you have been emailing me, which is great. So thank you all for posting and engaging with what our panelists have been saying. What I've done is try to collate some of those questions and sort of group them and summarize them, so that we've got a manageable number of questions to try and, you know, to try and get our panelists to engage with. What I'm going to do is kind of ask these questions, some of which are quite broad, and then to our three panelists, feel free to kind of jump in and answer. I may also kind of draw on you for particular insights that I think might be particularly useful in answering the questions. So we've had a few questions about research methodologies come in on the chat. Some of them focused on the work that Chris was doing and the recruitment methods. Some of them focused a bit more on the work that Susie was doing and how that polling works. What would be really useful here, I think, is if I can direct this question initially at Chris and Susie. I'm wondering, Chris, whether you can say something really quickly in answer to this question about how you went about recruiting the focus groups that you used across Europe, and specifically how you went about recruiting those in a way that did include the vulnerable people and vulnerable communities that this project was designed to canvass the opinions of.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for the question, which is a great one. So that with this research, if you haven't got people to talk to, then you don't do any research, right? It's just, it's you know, it's the most important part to do. And we were lucky. So I didn't mention, because I was so excited about the results, that the funders were an organisation called King Baudouin Foundation. They're based in Belgium, and but they kind of like a clearinghouse for a number of funders, IKEA and others came into it. And so there was, what happened was actually a call went out to across the countries for partners, national level partners who themselves had connections with community groups, churches, social welfare groups in those countries. So there was actually, they were connected with an existing network of places, groups, communities, that they could then come into that room, that space, and have this conversation with them. So we were very lucky there, but it was an important part of the project. To say recruitment, you know, without good recruitment, you don't do any research. You've got no one to speak to. So that's what happened there. But I think it is a very important part of the process. One of the other challenges, of course, we were doing this during COVID, and some of the challenges were around some of the Southern Europe countries. They could do it in the summer, do the groups outside. Some of the groups they were trying to do online, and there were challenges about access to technology, etc. So it was, you know, as always with social research, there's challenges to overcome. You're dealing with you're not in a laboratory. You know, it's not a culture petri dish where you can just control things. So that's how we did it there. Yeah. That helps.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's really interesting. Susie, I was wondering if I could ask you to reflect a bit on this question as well. You used obviously a very different methodology for the research that you were doing that was much more based around surveys and recruiting large numbers of people to engage with those surveys. I'm wondering whether you could just say a little bit about how you go about recruiting people for those surveys to make sure that you have a reflection of the society, in this case, the UK, that you are trying to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so For a start, I think all of our surveys, we try to make sure that they are sort of representative of the UK on a couple of key dimensions, and those are usually gender, age, and geography, and sometimes income, sometimes politics. In this case, I think just the first three. And what we also did in this case was we asked a couple of questions that would enable us to identify which Britain Talks climate segment they would fall in. And that draws on our previous work, which had a much larger sample and a much more representative sample as a result of that. And so we were able to match those numbers and see just, to make sure that we're not just reaching a very skewed sample. That's usually our technique. And then that's for surveys. For focus groups, we tend to recruit from the people who have completed the survey, and we'll have this percentage of how likely it is they are to fall into a particular segment. So we know that the people we're talking to really represent that group that they've been recruited for.
Thanks, Susie. I'm going to move on to another set of questions that came in now. We had several people asking about the policy implications of what we've all shared today. Robin, if I can, I'd like to bring this question initially to you. A few people have asked in various different forms in the chat, what does this mean for policymakers who are in the midst of creating net zero policies, and for the ways that they engage the public? So I think a few people were particularly interested in understanding how this research and practical work that we've been doing and sharing on this call should be shaping or changing the policies that are coming forward, or shaping and changing the way those policies are communicated to the public. Robin, if I can bring you in for an answer on this one first, that would be great.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I feel like I'm going to repeat myself here in thinking about that this is about fairness being embedded in the thought process, and therefore it can be a little bit hard to kind of break it down into sort of nuts and bolts. That, for example, while developing the report that we're working on right now, I've been talking to a colleague who's working with a group of MPs who are really interested in issues around climate change engagement, and saying it would be great if they had access to this report and the chance to think about it. And I think, politicians are not just lawmakers; they're also people who have quite a wide constituency, and they can speak to people. And I think that kind of idea of thinking about what fairness is and how you talk about it needs to be embedded at that political level, and I don't think it is at the moment. And I think so to some extent, as a bit of a job for us to get some of this work to those political policymakers who are actually thinking about the making of policy. I find it quite hard to kind of answer the nuts and bolts of the question, because I think it comes back to what Chris and Susie have been talking about, and actually thinking about the ins and outs of different policies and how they're specifically going to affect low-income groups, whether they're going to be fair or unfair, and how that is likely to be perceived by the public. And again, I think it's this. You can't just think about one. You can't just like create fundamentally unfair policy and then go out and sort of comms it really well and everything's going to be fine. You actually have to think about whether the policy in the first place is fair. And so, for example, under a major part of some of the debate around the UNFCCC negotiations COP in Glasgow last year, there was a big understanding about 100 billion of financial transfer that's needed from one in terms of reparations for climate damage. In there, that is a conversation ultimately about fairness. It's a conversation about justice. And that if those conversations are ignored or kind of, politicized out of existence, then ultimately you may well end up in a situation where you just can't reach agreement because people feel like they're being fundamentally unfairly treated. And I think that applies to our domestic policy as well. So I think one call I would make, I suppose, to politicians on the I don't quite know how to phrase this right, on the side of climate action, who are trying to make it happen, don't ignore it. Don't pretend that this is just an argument who are being made by conservative backbenchers or being bayed by those who are opposed to the action on climate change, and it's nothing to do with reality. It is reality, and as Chris has been talking about, you know, it's something that's really we have people who are living on low incomes don't necessarily have the capacity or ability in their lives to make changes. If you're living in a rented income in a rented house, you don't have the ability or money to sort of bring in some amazing new insulation technology. And so climate policy and the requirements and changes we're asking of society needs to take that into account. It needs to think about what are the processes that are going to empower people, that are going to incentivize people so that they actually benefit from these changes. And I think with the cost of living prices, with energy prices kind of shooting up right now, there's a real moment that politicians need to think about, you know, what is our response to this? And climate policy advocates have been speaking for a long time about the need to insulate the UK's incredibly leaky houses. And I think, like, it is true, and we're seeing the fundamental effects at the moment of like not doing that. So how can that process be put into process in a way that's fundamentally experienced as fair by the people who are going to be most affected? And I'm not quite sure how to sort of break that down more, but it just has to be in there. It has to be a part of it. And I think again, the researchers ever call for more research. I think, you know, as climate policies are developed, they should be explored as to how they're going to be experienced and perceived by different groups. And so often policy is brought in, and that's when you get when it's fundamentally rejected, because it just hasn't been thought about as to what it will mean for different parts of society, and it needs to be thought about, or it's a very high chance that it will be rejected.
Thanks, Robin. That's really useful. Susie, I'm wondering if I can bring you in on this question of political and policy implications. Your research, more than anything today, I think, really looked at those questions of political difference, right? The different ways that these policies are perceived as fair or unfair, based on people's political views and people's kind of deeply held values. And I'm wondering whether you can maybe just say something about what you think the implications are for politicians and policymakers, given what you found out during that research.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think this is it's an interesting, I saw in the chat there was a question about, you know, do we want to be tailoring our messages to all these different groups? And I think that's a really, that's a good question. It's one we get quite frequently. I think what the segmentation approach allows us to do, and allows us to sort of help other people do, is identify things that unify as well as things that divide. And in our work in this project and the project before, we tried to find points of sort of key risk where one group is likely to really react strongly to something, the way that, you know, a particular approach. And so I would say one of the strengths coming out of this is that we're able to identify where, for instance, people might see fairness in the same way, where they come together, and what the sort of key policy risks are. I think also coming back, I'm not sure if this is answering your question anymore, but coming back to something that Robin was saying earlier about, you know, making sure that policymakers look at the policies that they're implementing and exactly how that will affect people. One of the interesting things that we came up against in this work is around the example of flight taxes, which, you know, we know that a very small percentage of the UK fly very often, and we ask this in the survey as well, and we ask people how often they fly and how willing they would be to pay a flight tax on their first, second, third, fourth, fifth flight, so on. And we were surprised by the number of people who were just against that in principle. even though they don't fly. And actually the people who were most willing to pay an additional flight tax were the ones that were most likely to fly. And in a way that sort of was like, yeah, I don't want to change the way I'm living, so I'm happy to pay a little bit more for that. But for the rest, there were lots of questions around the implementation of this policy. How are people going to track this? What if I have a family emergency? What if these circumstances arise and I don't want to have to pay more? So I think there's a lot to be done around not only the sort of the implications of the policy, but also explaining how it might be done and to ensure that it will be fair in those cases.
Thanks, Susie. That's really interesting. We're coming up to time, I'm afraid. We need to wrap up in the next few minutes and let everyone get to their next meetings or whatever else they have on today. So I think I'm going to draw a close to this part of the event. Thank you firstly to our panelists today for coming and sharing the insights from your work. I hope that everyone has found that useful and illuminating. Thank you, of course, as well to our audience, firstly for coming and listening, but also for the really engaging questions that you've posted in the chat. Thank you for engaging with what we've been saying and asking us such interesting questions on it. I hope that our answers have been useful and helpful to you in the work that you're doing.